Question 1. What should we make of Lavrov in a Basquiat t-shirt and with an iPhone in Indonesia? Well, you know what an iPhone is, and it looks like he's got the latest one because the cameras are really protruding. And Basquiat was not a great artist, but a compelling artist whose best work was accomplished and powerful if you stand in front of it. And he died at a criminally young age at the end of the 80s. But what do we make of all of this? What do we make of folks from the Putin regime indulging themselves in all of these Western things? Is this something that we just superficially tease them for on social media? Or do we have a deeper point that we're making when we're saying, what are you talking about, you Putinite folks? You've got your little stories and then off you go and set up Swiss and Italian bank accounts, Swiss and Italian villas. Your kids seem to be getting educated in the West and even full-time living in the West, at least up until the recent sanctions. So do we have just a tease there? Do we have a significant point? I actually think we have a significant point, and so this tease is more than reasonable to take seriously. There is a kind of story that I think is absolutely basic to Russian political discourse, and it's catastrophic. And that's that there's a certain kind of primitive state of the Russian soul, and we've got to return to it. That is in large part what many in the Putin regime half believe and advocate. But it's worse than this, because they are saying that this fiction is something we've got to return to. But then Russian opposition, to a large extent, buy into that image too. And they say, well, yes, there is this sort of state of the Russian soul, and the thing is that we've got to transcend it and move toward Western civilization and embrace liberal democracy. Now, if that primitive state of the Russian soul is a fiction, and much of what's so dysfunctional in Russia, much of the dysfunctionality of Russians as citizens too, is to be explained in other terms, in terms that are to do with various political and social and economic developments in Russia over the last couple of centuries, then that's very important, because it means that the whole carousel of Russian discourse is rotating around the kind of fiction, and we're going to say more about that. And so teasing Lavrov for going on about this sort of return to Russianness proper, when in fact in private life he doesn't, none of his mates do, none of them take seriously the idea there's anything there, except episodically. They like to do a kind of ritual here and there, pick out a few quotes here and there. So they themselves, at a stretch, take it quarter seriously, that there is this sort of state of the Russian soul. And so it's right to tease them, and it's very important to probe what actually is going on there, and are we all not, when we're talking about Russia, at risk of rotating around the kind of fiction. Is Prigozhin vying for the leadership of Russia? I don't know what he's vying for. There is a kind of consensus that Prigozhin likes to be a sufficiently independent actor, to the extent to which he wouldn't, as a result of which he wouldn't want to take part in politics proper. It's hard to know. Here is what I would say. All of these people are trying to attain, in the first instance, negative aspirations. They're trying to avoid stuff. So somebody like Prigozhin is maneuvering to avoid certain bad outcomes. He is maneuvering to avoid being, for some reason, clamped down by the regime, but also avoid being clamped down by some kind of inter-elite warfare when the regime wobbles. So they are aspiring to a lot of negative targets. They want to, as it were, stay alive for as long as possible, no matter what happens. Both literally and metaphorically. Is Putin making any plans after the war? I think it's unhelpful to think along these terms because Putin is engaged in what I call a pattern of escalation, and that pattern ain't going to stop until the regime basically collapses or dramatically changes shape. So if you call that pattern of escalation a war, then the war is simply linked to the regime, and there isn't a way of thinking of what happens after it. This regime is interminably engaged in the kind of war until the regime is terminated. That's a more constructive way of thinking about it, I think. You've talked about parts of the left and right wanting to make concessions to Putin, but what about those who see Putin as actually offering an alternative to what they perceive as US domination? I think that there are some on different sides of the political spectrum, insofar as you can even recognize a political spectrum, who have some positive, or in the West, who have some positive sympathies with Putin, and hence my often recited prediction that if Putin stays, his popularity will grow. I mean, let me just say a couple of things. Just because it says something on the tin doesn't mean that the stuff inside is going to be what, the way it's labeled. So you could have a coffee shop selling sausages. So you have to say, well, is this person who is sympathizing with Putin genuinely left-wing? Or is this person genuinely right-wing? Or is this some kind of a grift? Or is this some kind of an ideologically unplaceable anti-hegemonic gambit? There's something they don't like about the hegemonic situation, and anything that's not that, they're going to side with. So I think that it's important to ask ourselves, when we say something like, well, this Putin sympathizer is right-wing, this Putin sympathizer is left-wing, what exactly are we saying in explanatory terms about them? Or are we just sort of lazily using labels? Both, both possibilities are there. Somebody could be pro-Putin and tie that into some kind of ideological disposition they have. But it's important to, I think, not in the case of each individual, but if you like, in the case of each cultural bubble we're trying to explain, it's important to address this question. Can you talk about the morality of collateral damage? On the Philosophy Channel, we will. The way you basically talk about this is by understanding that one and the same social practice can come under different ethical concepts. We all know about that. So, for instance, decades back in the West, corporal punishment may have come under ethical concepts like discipline, child improvement, education. Now it might come under abuse and assault. So sometimes it happens that the same practice comes to operate under different ethical concepts. And so I do actually have a view about collateral damage, not just to do with this war, and that's that it is to some extent, and this requires some kind of a thing, an article or a paper, that it's to some extent placed under the wrong ethical concepts. It's placed too much under concepts like accident and inadvertent, morally bad acts. And it should be, given what we typically call collateral damage, closer to the realm of murder and killing. It's very important to understand that if you place an act under such a category, it doesn't make it wrong. Big states will say, well, we need to do this murder, we need to do these killings. There isn't going to be a major power that doesn't kill a lot of people. But nevertheless, a truthful conversation about what we're talking about here, when we talk about collateral damage, even when we're talking about collateral damage resulting from the action of states that, unlike Russia, are genuinely trying to minimize civilian casualties. It still may be that since a certain amount of death is calculated into the action you're taking, that it's hard to call that death as accidental as we typically call it. So I have a view about that. I might talk about it in more detail. In terms of how collateral damage is practically used in Ukraine, well, I do think that the Russians keep thinking about it. For example, Russians know that if they hit key infrastructure, that this is going to lead to death and suffering and misery in Ukraine. And while Russians are also hitting civilian buildings directly, they are trying to hit infrastructure instead of just hitting civilian buildings. For the most part, because they know that if all they did was just hit civilian buildings, this would activate Western citizenries more. And that logic doesn't matter how you place what I've just said, but that logic is constantly there in the Kremlin. How can we do a certain amount of harm to Ukrainians, without it looking so bad as to antagonize Western democratic citizenships into sustained support? So that's a ramble, but that's a little bit on this. Can you comment on how denazification has become desatanization? Well, denazification, it seems to me, just flopped for the Russians, and so they gave up on it. Desatanization is a bit connected to those myths about the Russian soul and Russia's distinct path. So the idea is to take something off the shelf that is going to have, of course, limited grip, because anybody serious will laugh at this idea, but it's going to have some kind of grip and will in some people's minds resonate to some extent with certain orthodox religious ideas and so on. Well, it's got a limited amount of purchase, and it's being used as a piece of political technology. Putin himself, of course, would not believe, even though Putin does go in for quite a few, occultish rituals and superstitions. Putin himself would not take that idea of desatanization seriously for a fraction of a second. But they've wheeled this out, and it's possible that 3 to 6 months later they'll wheel out something else. Lots of love toxin.